Why should you learn a language? Why should anybody learn an additional language? It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort, it takes a lot of dedication. And to be honest, in my experience as a language teacher, I've seen many people put a lot of hours into the endeavour and not really have much to show for it. So before we get stuck into that, I wanted to do something a little bit different today. If you follow this channel because you're interested in the Hittite for Complete Beginners, don't worry, I'm just finishing off class number 4. That will be released in under 24 hours, I guess. But today I wanted to experiment with doing a type of video where I can just talk to the camera, express my ideas, express my experience, and get a video out with a relatively quick turnaround time that doesn't take hours to edit and stuff like that. So if you follow my channel, you might be aware that I'm rather interested in dead languages, languages which only a few people work with and nobody speaks with in their day-to-day lives in 2023. But I think that what I'm going to talk about today is also applicable to anybody that's learning any second language. And when I ask people in my job, the language that I teach, the vast majority of my language classes is English as a second language. And when I talk to my students or prospective students and I ask them, why they want to learn English, invariably it's because it's connected with the fact that nowadays English is one of the lingua francas of the world. And if you want to get by in academia or business very often, you need to have a working knowledge of English, and that's what motivates people to learn. And that's fine, that's fantastic. But what if you know English? What if you've already learned English as a second language? What if you're a native speaker of English? Are people motivated then to learn subsequent languages? And the answer is, some people might be and some people might not be. There's many people who only speak English as a first language and don't speak any second language. And so I think when people, in my experience, decide that they want to learn language and it's invariably English, the reason that they want to learn that language is because they want to communicate, right? They want to communicate their academic ideas or their business ideas. Or, it might be easy for them to get to know, to socialize people when they're on trips or travels or things like this. And communication is absolutely a fantastic reason to learn a foreign language. It's difficult, however, when you're interested in things like I'm interested in, which, for example, might be Old English or Hittite or Luvian or Babylonian or Ancient Greek, because these are languages that people don't communicate in nowadays. Well, with English and Greek, obviously we communicate in a much more in our contemporary versions of these languages, but I would imagine that very few people are communicating on a day-to-day basis in Old English or in Ancient Greek, other than for some entertainment or personal purposes. For example, I'm in a Facebook group where we communicate in Old English just for fun, just to get to know other people who are interested in Old English and the things that go along with learning Old English. But I think one of the most overlooked benefits of learning a foreign language is the fact that when you learn a foreign language, you invariably learn about the culture that language is used in. And, I see a lot of people nowadays that they might go on holiday, for example. They might go on holiday for 2 weeks to Indonesia, and they come back and they feel that like they're an encyclopedia of Indonesian culture and history and society and stuff like that. And I'm not saying that, going to visit any country doesn't upskill your knowledge of that country. But I think it's almost arrogant to feel that, or to state that after, a 2 week, a week, even, a month holiday somewhere, a month traveling somewhere, that you have any type of authority to talk about the cultural society. And I think that when you learn a language, it's a much better way to learn about a culture and a society than just visiting it or being a tourist or communicating with some people from it. Because when you learn a language, you can pick up those kind of, specific elements that make up that language. You might find a word or a phrase that is very difficult to translate into your native language. For example, the second language that I speak very well is Polish, or reasonably well, not very well, is Polish language. And for example, in Polish language, we have a noun or a verb, kombinować. And I always struggle to translate this verb into English. It kind of means somebody who wheels, who deals, who tries to find or put together some solution to a problem that might not be the straightest of solutions or something like that. It's difficult to translate. And the fact that this verb exists in Polish indicates something to me about Poland as a society, as a culture, why that verb needs to exist in and of itself. Or, for example, in Polish language, they have perhaps a finer way of describing interpersonal relations, because there are, in English, you've kind of got friend, mate, acquaintance, and that's pretty much it. When somebody, very rarely people use the word friend, in my experience. Very often people are using the word mate. So when somebody introduces me to their mate, I actually have very little idea about where, like the level of that relationship, the closeness of that relationship. Maybe if they use the word friend, it would indicate that it's a particularly close relationship, but even then I would be unsure. In Polish, they have a much wider variety of vocabulary to describe interpersonal relations. And I find that very useful. And I'm sometimes missing that when I'm using English language. But the fact that Polish has that probably tells you something about Polish culture and Polish society. That for whatever reason, they feel the need to put these different categories of relationships and name them differently and categorize them perhaps differently than the very broad spectrum that we use in English. Obviously, when you learn a foreign language, you can interact with, you can participate in cultural events that occur in where that language is spoken, for example. So you're not only just a passive guest if you go to, for example, let's say you learn Italian as a second language and you go to an Italian wedding. You're now just not like a passive guest, the guy that, maybe some people will go and speak whatever your first language is with. But you can now participate in that activity. You can now be a more or less functioning part of that activity. You can also go and watch the television programs, read the books, read the literature that particular language has produced. And even though one language might be spread over quite, diverse cultures, as you take, for example, English, you've got, you've got the island of Britain. We've got Ireland where English is spoken. You've got North America where English is spoken. Australia, New Zealand. These are all different cultures. It's, maybe there's similarities between them, but I think I would be causing many people in America great offence, or in the USA a great offence, if I said that our cultures are identical. They're not identical, they're similar. We share similarities, usually because of shared culture and shared history. But I would say if you want to really get in touch with American culture, you could take as many 2-week holidays there as you want, but you'd never learn as much as you would if you spoke English, American English, and were able to engage with and interact with the cultural output of that particular country, whether it's films, books, whatever, or, as I said, participating in the culture of that country, cultural output of that country. And that, for me, is the most overriding reason to learn a foreign language. Communication is very important, but for me, where my background, I'm in from the United Kingdom, I speak English as a first language. Communication isn't high on my priorities when it comes to learning any language, because, to be honest, more often than not, people will prefer to communicate with me in English anyway. If I go to a conference in Germany, probably the people that are there, all the guests that are there, might be from different countries. English will be the language that we communicate in. There's not, even if I spoke German, I might not have opportunity to use it, because it doesn't mean that if I am in a conversation with a German person, that the third person in that conversation necessarily speaks German. They could be French or from Belgium or from wherever. They might speak German. but not necessarily. So we'd probably use English as our language of communication. And so I've got that base sorted, covered. I understand for different people, their motivations to learn English might be more focused on that communicative aspect. But for me, and I expect a lot of people who are watching this now that come from an English as a first language background or English as a very proficient background, communication is probably not high on your list of reasons to learn an additional language. Being able to interact with and access the cultural output of the language that you're speaking, or the nations and the cultures associated with the language that you're learning, is by far the most important reason to pick up, and the most rewarding reason to pick up an additional language. And so sometimes people ask me, when they see me, for example, I mean, I'm quite honest. Like last summer I went to Cyprus on holiday, and I had both my ancient Greek book, my Babylonian book, and my Hittite book, and I was reading them when I'm on the beach with the family and the kids and they're playing and stuff like that, building sandcastles. I'll grab myself a drink and sit down and read 1 or 2 pages of my Hittite book, for example. And some people, passers-by, people we were sat next to, would ask me, why are you learning Hittite? Is it your job? Do you work in academia? Do you research this language? And it's not my job. I would say that less than 1% of my income is generated from working with languages from Antiquity. Sometimes I might have a small project, translation project or whatever in Latin. Sometimes I might have a small project in another language from Antiquity, from the Iron Age or the Bronze Age. But it's like less than 1% of my income, significantly less than 1% of my income. So I have some professional buy into it, but not much. For me, the reason that I study these languages is, one, it's fun, right? The element, I think, of, for me, opening my Hittite book or my Babylonian book and reading a page or two of Hittite grammar or vocabulary or Babylonian grammar or vocabulary is a much more productive way than just mindlessly scrolling through my phone. And, but secondly, if you're interested in that time period, which I'm very much interested in the Iron Age and the Bronze Age. You don't have the ability in the modern world to communicate with a Babylonian speaker. You don't have the ability in the modern world to communicate with an old Irish speaker. It's actually difficult enough to communicate in Irish with people in my experience. And I know maybe many people from Ireland would disagree with me, but I studied Irish for a period of time, happily went on holiday to Ireland, and I didn't get much opportunity to practice my Irish, unfortunately. I also studied Welsh, and it was much easier to find people to speak Welsh with. But Old Irish, I would imagine that you could probably count on your fingers the number of people that could have some type of communication with you in Old Irish, and probably not in speech, but in written form. Because even reconstructing the language of everyday conversation can be difficult for these languages from the Iron Age, Bronze Age, Antiquity, things like that. But I think if you want to learn about the culture and the environment of the period of time where Old Irish was spoken, the easiest way to do that is to learn Old Irish and to read the cultural outputs that people produce in Old Irish. The same for Hittite, the same for Ancient Greek, the same for the Old Norse, same for Old English. You can passively digest as much information from books and YouTube videos and stuff like this, but this is regurgitated information. This is information that people have processed and presented for you. By learning a language from Antiquity that nobody speaks, a dead language, or learning any language in the modern world, allows you first-hand experience with the culture of that country, nation state, time period, whatever. And for me, that's the most overriding and important reason and motivating reason to learn any language, whether it's a living or a dead one. Sometimes people ask me for my advice for learning languages. I always tell people, get a good book and use that as your foundation. Find a series that you like. I like the Teach Yourself series. So I have the Teach Yourself book for complete Old English, For me, it was the easiest one to get into. I'm familiar with the style because it's similar in other books. I have other textbooks and grammars for Old English. They're also great. They might be great for other people. But for me, I got most of my knowledge from the Teach Yourself series. And I know that I can reliably go back to that series. Or if I'm learning another language, for example, Luvian, and there isn't a Teach Yourself Luvian, I can find a book of the few that are available that closest resembles the format that is presented in the Teach Yourself book, because I know they work for me. And your answer might be different. Different types of books might work for you. Maybe books don't work for you at all, and you need a YouTube course or something like this. Go and find a YouTube course, understand why that style works for you, and that'll help you in the future be able to pick out other YouTube courses that you can use and complement your learning with. Obviously, if you're learning a living language, go to a service like italki, find yourself a teacher. Doesn't have to be a qualified teacher. It can be somebody new starting out, or if you want, it could be a very qualified, very experienced teacher. But having that opportunity, having that time in your schedule every week, even if it's just 45 minutes of active speaking practice, if it's a currently spoken language, is invaluable and very motivating. Supplement your learning with audio courses, with other ways that you can passively get contact with that language, so that perhaps when you're half doing something else, you can also half be learning your target language. So for me, in terms of learning languages from Antiquity, it's quite difficult. It's very difficult to find a speaker of Hittite walking around today in 2023. So I try to utilize flashcards. I utilize flashcards if I'm learning a living language as well, but I try to utilize them more when I'm learning a language from Antiquity. Carry them in my pocket when I'm at the supermarket and I've got a spare 30 seconds or a minute or 2 minutes or 3 minutes in the queue. Don't unlock your phone. Take out your flashcards, go through them, practice that vocabulary. Walk through the supermarket if you've been learning the maybe foodstuffs in ancient Greek or Babylonian or whatever, Old Irish, whatever it is you're learning. Try and, name the foodstuffs. You won't know all of them, but you might know some of them, and it's useful to execute that activity. So, you want to look for opportunities to increase your contact with that language. Obviously, if it's a living language, you need to factor in the fact that you need listening practice and speaking practice. If it's a dead language, you can focus just more on the writing production of it or the reading understanding of that language. But you need to find a balance between all of the skills required to learn that language. And utilize idle periods of time. That's my advice. My final piece of advice is that motivation is a really bad thing. And maybe motivation is good at the beginning. You've got energy, you want to learn something. But we all have to accept at some point, motivation is going to disappear. We're going to wake up one day and we're not going to be motivated. We're going to be tired, we're going to be distracted with other stuff. And what happens then? Well, we might skip our learning sessions, and that's a problem. Now, I use the example of brushing my teeth. So I am not motivated to brush my teeth in any way. There's no motivation there at all. I just do it. I don't even think about it. I wake up and it's part of my routine. I brush my teeth. I have my lunch. I brush my teeth. Before I go to bed, I brush my teeth. There's no motivation there at all. Now, this is, of course, just a 1 minute, 2 minute period. 2 minute period 3 times a day. So it's easier perhaps just to consider it as something like this. But you need to get yourself in a point with your language learning, whether it's a living language or whether it's a dead language, that you just do it. You don't even think about it. That if at, Saturday morning, 9 o'clock, you do your 30 minutes of grammar practice. Or Tuesday, 2 o'clock, you do your 30-minute conversation with your teacher or whatever. And but you need to take motivation out of the equation. It just needs to become part of your life. And then you just learn it. And it's kind of amazing because you'll wake up in a year and you'll be like, oh, wow, I know all this stuff. And you might not appreciate that as you incrementally go on that journey because, it's hard to see that progress when you're in motion. But when you take a step back after a period of time and you start looking back at the things that you did 6 months ago, a year ago, you'll be like, oh, wow, I've learned something. I know something now. And that's a great feeling. And that will then get you going back. It's like with anything, I guess, like with taking up the gym. Being motivated for the gym is great in January and February, but you need something more than motivation for the rest of the year. It needs to become part of your habit, part of your routine. And that is the thinking that you need to achieve with learning a language. So that's what I wanted to talk about today. Very often, as a language teacher and as somebody who studies languages and studies dead languages, I get asked the question all the time, why learn a language? Why learn Polish? Why learn Romanian? Why learn modern Greek? And why on earth are you learning ancient Greek or Babylonian or whatever language I'm studying? And my answer is always, it is the way to engage with the cultural output where that language was used. And I think it's one of the more beautiful parts of acquiring a second language. My advice for learning is forget motivation, make it part of your routine, find many resources and understand what works for you. And it might not be that it will work for every language. I remember that I used Pimsleur audio courses to give myself like a pre-intermediate level of Ukrainian before I went to live in Ukraine about 15 years ago. Now, the audio courses worked for me because I kind of knew the grammar from my experience with learning Russian and Polish, and I knew the alphabet because I'd learned Polish previously. So an audio course was enough for me, and I waltzed through it. Would I recommend an audio course to learn Greek? Probably not, because you need some experience with the alphabet and things like this. But it's about finding what works for you and utilising that idle time to maximise your learning output during a particular week or whatever period of time you're managing yourself on. So that's my advice for today. I hope it's been useful for you. If you don't usually tune into this channel, I hope my words of wisdom resonate with you. If you do usually tune into this channel, don't worry. In less than 24 hours, as I said, we'll have the next Hittite class up and running live. It was great speaking to you today, and I'll look forward to speaking to you again very shortly. All the best.